There's a photo on my phone that makes me feel physically sick. I still haven't deleted it. And believe me, I've tried. A few times, actually. I'll open my camera roll at like 1 in the morning when I can't sleep, stare at it for a few seconds, hover my thumb over the trash icon and think, okay, enough, just delete it already, and then I can't do it. Every single time. It's this completely normal photo. That's the disturbing part. Nothing dramatic. No weird expression. No obvious clue hiding in the background waiting to be discovered. Just me and my best friend standing by a lake. We're holding plastic cups of wine. I'm laughing so hard my eyes are half closed. She's leaning into me smiling. We look happy. I was happy. And the reason that photo keeps messing with my head now is because, by the time it was taken, she had already been lying to me for almost 2 years. She already knew what she was doing. That realization genuinely changed something in me. Because I look at that woman in the photo, and she looks so safe. So certain about who she's standing beside. And I want to reach into the picture and warn her somehow. I know that sounds dramatic. Maybe it is dramatic. But I swear to God, once you realize somebody you trusted completely was quietly manipulating you the entire time, it changes the texture of your memories afterward. It's like all your old memories develop this second layer underneath them. I don't know how else to explain it. And the weird thing is, I've never actually said any of this out loud before. Not fully. I came close once with my sister. We were sitting in her kitchen drinking coffee and she asked me why Dana and I weren't talking anymore, and I started explaining it and then halfway through I literally changed the subject. Just completely bailed out of my own story. Because saying it out loud made it feel too real. Even now, honestly, part of me wants to stop talking about this entirely because there's something deeply embarrassing about admitting you trusted the wrong person for that long. Especially at this age. I'm 45 years old. I should know how to read people by now. That's what I keep thinking. And before anybody says it, yes, I know manipulation can happen to anyone. I know that intellectually. But emotionally? Emotionally it still feels humiliating sometimes. Like I missed something obvious. Or maybe, no. See, even now I do that. I still try to make it my fault somehow because the alternative is accepting that some people are just frighteningly good at becoming exactly what you need them to be. Dana was like that. God, even saying her name out loud still feels strange now. We met at work about 9 years ago. I had just transferred into a new department, project coordination, nothing glamorous, and I remember feeling kind of invisible at the time. Not devastated or depressed or anything dramatic. Just lonely in that quiet adult way people don't talk about enough. You know? Where your life is technically full. Marriage, kids, work, responsibilities. But emotionally you still feel weirdly disconnected sometimes. And Dana walked into that version of my life like she'd been designed for it. Everybody loved her immediately. She was one of those women who somehow remembered every tiny thing people told her. Your kid's soccer game. Your husband's surgery. Your favorite snack from the vending machine. She baked cookies for the office for no reason. She left encouraging notes on desks before presentations. At the time, it felt incredibly genuine. And maybe parts of it were. That's what still confuses me. Because I need to be careful here, I don't want to rewrite history into something cartoonish. She wasn't some evil mastermind sitting in a dark room plotting against people. If she'd been obviously fake, none of this would have happened. No. Dana was subtle. She had this very specific way of making you feel emotionally singled out. Like she saw something special in you specifically. And when you're somebody who's been quietly lonely for a while, that kind of attention hits hard. We became close fast. Faster than I usually let people in, honestly. I'm not naturally a quick trust person. I normally observe people for a long time before I fully relax around them. But with her, it felt effortless. Safe. By the second year of our friendship, she was the first person I wanted to call when anything happened. Good news. Bad news. Anxiety spirals at 11 o'clock at night. Random thoughts during Target runs. Everything. And the terrifying thing is, nothing about it felt fake then. That's what still bothers me. If she had seemed fake, I would have backed away immediately. But she didn't. She knew things about me nobody else knew. Things about my marriage I hadn't even fully admitted to myself yet. Things about my mother getting sick. About my panic attacks in 2019. About money fears I never talked about openly because on paper we were fine, and I felt guilty struggling emotionally when other people had real problems. She knew all of it. And I trusted her completely. Like fully, deeply, embarrassingly trusted her. That's what makes this whole thing hard to explain now, because when people hear betrayal stories, they usually expect one huge moment. One giant shocking discovery where everything suddenly becomes clear. That's not what this was. This was slower. Smaller. Which honestly made it more dangerous. Because there were signs early on. Tiny signs. And every single time one appeared, I explained it away almost immediately. The first one happened about a year into our friendship. We both applied for the same internal promotion at work. And I remember being weirdly proud of how mature we both acted about it. We had this whole conversation over lunch where we agreed it wouldn't affect our friendship. Whoever gets it buys the other margaritas, she joked. And I laughed. God. I can still hear her laugh when I think about that conversation. Anyway, I didn't get the promotion. She did. And honestly? At the time I was genuinely happy for her. Disappointed for myself, sure, but not angry. She was qualified. Smart. Organized. Everybody liked her. It made sense. What I didn't know until years later, and this still makes my stomach drop when I think about it, was that before interviews even happened, she privately went to our supervisor with concerns about me. Not accusations exactly. That's what made it so slippery. Just little comments. Little suggestions planted carefully enough that they couldn't be directly challenged later. Questions about whether I seemed overwhelmed lately. Whether I was distracted. Whether I was handling pressure well. Things that sound caring if you phrase them correctly while quietly damaging somebody behind the scenes. And the worst part? When I finally found out years later, I still defended her. I actually sat there trying to explain her behavior to myself because by then losing the friendship felt more terrifying than confronting what was right in front of me. And what I didn't realize then, what I really didn't realize, was that this was only the beginning of what she was already taking from me. By the time I found out about the promotion thing, Dana and I had already been best friends for 4 years. 4 years is long enough that someone stops feeling like a friend and starts feeling built into the structure of your life. She wasn't just somebody I grabbed lunch with occasionally. She was part of my routines. Part of my emotional wiring, honestly. If something happened during the day, something funny, stressful, embarrassing, my brain automatically went, I need to tell Dana. That reflex was constant. And I think that's why what happened afterward got so tangled in my head. Because once somebody becomes emotionally automatic to you, your brain protects them differently. I didn't understand that at the time. I do now. When I first heard what she'd said to our supervisor years earlier, I remember physically feeling the room tilt for a second. Not dramatically. Just this weird internal wobble. Like, that can't be right. But almost immediately after that feeling came the excuses. Maybe there's context missing. Maybe she was genuinely worried. Maybe someone misunderstood the conversation. Maybe. I built an entire defense case for her before she even knew there was a problem. And looking back now, that scares me a little. Not because it means I was weak. I don't actually think I was weak. I think attachment does strange things to perception. When somebody becomes emotionally important enough, your brain starts filtering reality through preservation first. You want the relationship to survive. Truth becomes secondary. That's hard to admit, but it's true. And honestly, I think Dana sensed that about me long before I did. I don't know if it was conscious. I genuinely still don't know. Some days I think she absolutely understood exactly how loyal I was and used it strategically. Other days I wonder if she just moved through relationships instinctively, taking what she needed without fully examining herself. But either way, the result was the same. Because after that, the money thing started. And this is still the part one struggle most to talk about because I can already hear how people react to it. $15,000. I know. Trust me, nobody hears that number louder than I do. Even now when I say it out loud, part of me immediately wants to explain myself. Like I need people to understand I'm not reckless. I'm not stupid. This wasn't some random internet scam. This was somebody I trusted more than almost anyone in my life. Dana had started a consulting business on the side. Operations consulting. Systems management. Process organization. Stuff she actually was good at. That's another thing that complicates the story emotionally. She genuinely was talented. Competent. Convincing. Nothing about it looked fake. And that's important. Because if it had looked fake, I would have backed away immediately. That's the part that still bothers me. The terrifying part wasn't that I ignored obvious danger signs. It's that there weren't obvious danger signs at first. There were spreadsheets. Business plans. Client calls. Contracts. Real meetings. Real work happening. Which made trusting her feel reasonable. Safe, even. She framed it as a temporary investment. Just enough to stabilize things while she expanded. And I barely hesitated. That's the truth I hate most. I barely hesitated because by then, emotionally, Dana existed in the same category in my brain as family. My husband was the one who pushed back. I still remember that conversation so clearly because we rarely argued about money. Ever. He kept saying, very calmly, I'm not accusing her of anything. I just think this is a lot of money. And I got defensive immediately. Way too defensive. I said, you don't know her like I do. God. That sentence still makes me cringe physically. Because I really believed it. I thought I had special insight into who she was. Like our closeness gave me access to some deeper truth about her character that other people couldn't see. And now. Looking back? I think maybe that was part of the entire dynamic. She made people feel uniquely chosen by her. Specifically understood. Specifically trusted. Which meant questioning her started to feel emotionally disloyal somehow. That's such a dangerous dynamic once I see it clearly now. But at the time? It just felt like friendship. The first few months after I gave her the money were completely normal. Honestly, they were reassuring. She sent frequent updates about the business. Detailed ones. Voice notes while driving between meetings. Excited texts about new clients. Financial projections. Future plans. And every update lowered my anxiety. See? Everything's fine. You're overthinking. Then slowly, the rhythm changed. So slowly, I almost didn't notice it happening. The updates became less detailed. Then less frequent. Then delayed. Sometimes weeks would pass before she mentioned the business at all, and by the time I finally asked, she'd already have a perfectly reasonable explanation waiting. A delayed invoice. A banking issue. A difficult client. Family stress. And every explanation came wrapped in warmth and emotional vulnerability. That's the important part. She never sounded cold or evasive. She sounded overwhelmed. Guilty. Human. Which made me feel guilty for even asking. That's the part people don't understand unless they've experienced this kind of manipulation specifically. It doesn't always feel manipulative while it's happening. Sometimes it feels like intimacy. Sometimes the manipulation is making you feel cruel for doubting someone who appears emotionally sincere. I remember one dinner specifically. We were sharing fries and drinking wine and laughing about something stupid from work, and I had this moment where I looked across the table at her and thought, "You're becoming paranoid." Because she still knew exactly how to make me feel emotionally safe. That never stopped. Even while things were quietly unraveling underneath us. And then one night, probably around 2 in the morning because apparently all emotional crises happen at 2 in the morning, I started Googling relationship manipulation dynamics after another strange interaction with her. I don't even remember exactly what triggered it anymore. Just this feeling that something wasn't lining up. And I found this article discussing emotional dependency and relational control patterns, and there was one sentence that genuinely made my stomach drop. When trust becomes the delivery system. I remember staring at that line for a really long time. Because suddenly the entire friendship felt different for half a second. Like all the emotional closeness itself might have been part of the mechanism. And honestly, that thought scared me enough that I closed my laptop immediately. I wasn't ready to go there yet. I still wanted her to be the person I thought she was. Maybe especially then. Because once real doubt enters a relationship, your memories start rearranging themselves. And what happened next, this tiny, stupid moment in a grocery store, was the first thing that made it impossible for me to keep rearranging them back. It's honestly embarrassing how small the grocery store moment was. If somebody described it to me before all this happened, I probably would have said they were overthinking. Maybe I was overthinking. I still don't know sometimes. But I do know that the second it happened, something inside me shifted. I was standing near the produce section trying to decide whether I needed avocados badly enough to pay $7 for them, and this woman I vaguely knew came up to say hi. One of those familiar but not close people. We'd met a couple times through mutual friends. Nice enough. Casual conversation. Nothing important. And at some point Dana's name came up naturally because back then Dana's name came up in almost every area of my life. And this woman paused. Just for a second. But it was enough. I can still picture her expression perfectly. It wasn't shock. It wasn't gossip. It was more like restraint. Like somebody almost reacting honestly and then catching themselves halfway through. And then she smiled and said, "Oh, you're still close with her. That's great." That's it. That was the whole interaction. But the word still hit me strangely immediately. Still. Like there was a reason I maybe shouldn't be. I drove home replaying that moment over and over like an insane person. I probably spent 45 minutes dissecting one woman's facial expression at red lights. And I know how ridiculous that sounds. But sometimes your instincts notice things before your conscious mind catches up. I really believe that now. Because by the time I pulled into my driveway, my brain had already started pulling old memories forward automatically. The promotion. The weird repayment patterns. A few strange reactions from people over the years when I mentioned Dana casually. And then this one memory surfaced so sharply it actually made my chest tighten. A work event from years earlier. Dana introducing me to somebody as her associate. Associate. I don't even fully understand why that word bothered me so much afterward. At the time I barely registered it. But once everything started unraveling, that memory kept replaying in my head constantly because, associate? After 7 years? After hospital waiting rooms and late-night phone calls and vacations and crying in each other's kitchens? Associate. It suddenly made me wonder whether we had been experiencing the relationship completely differently the entire time. And honestly, that thought terrified me. Because if the emotional closeness wasn't mutual, then what exactly had I been participating in for 9 years? That question started eating at me slowly. And after the grocery store thing, I began paying attention differently. That's really the moment everything changed. Not externally. Internally. Once you start observing someone through a different lens, tiny things become impossible to ignore. Patterns emerge. And the terrifying part is how quickly your brain starts connecting them. I realized something one night lying awake in bed that genuinely unsettled me. I knew Dana emotionally, but I didn't actually know her concretely. I knew how she felt. I knew her opinions. Her humor. Her habits. Her emotional stories. But factual things? Real structural things? Not really. I'd never met certain close friends she talked about constantly. Some stories changed slightly over time. Different areas of her life existed in strangely separate compartments that almost never overlapped naturally. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop noticing it. It was like realizing someone had carefully curated different versions of themselves for different groups of people. And I had simply assumed my version was the authentic one. God. That realization honestly made me nauseous for a while. Because I kept wondering, was she adapting herself to people intentionally? Or do some people just do that automatically without fully realizing it? I still don't know. And maybe I never will. That uncertainty became its own kind of obsession. I started asking tiny questions casually. Nothing confrontational. Just little conversational nudges designed to test consistency. Questions about timelines. Old friendships. Business details. People she referenced. And something happened almost immediately that I still think about constantly. She got warmer. Noticeably warmer. More attentive. More affectionate. More emotionally available. Suddenly there were more thinking about you texts. More check-ins. More compliments. More emotional intimacy. And this is the part where I need to be brutally honest because it would be easier to pretend otherwise. Part of me loved it. Even while I was becoming suspicious. That's what makes emotional manipulation so confusing sometimes. The comfort doesn't disappear immediately just because doubt enters the room. I'd catch myself relaxing again. Thinking maybe I imagined everything. Maybe stress was making me paranoid. Maybe I was projecting meaning onto random coincidences. Then another weird moment would happen and the entire cycle would restart. Over and over. And meanwhile the money situation kept quietly deteriorating in the background. She did pay some of it back. That matters to me for some reason because I think people want stories like this to be cleaner than they are. Over roughly 2 years, she repaid around $9,000 in pieces. Always with emotional explanations attached. I feel awful about this. You've been unbelievably patient. I hate disappointing you. And looking back now, something about those conversations feels deeply unsettling because somehow they always ended with me comforting her. I didn't fully realize that while it was happening. But afterward? Once I stepped back and replayed everything, I saw it clearly. Every conversation about my missing money somehow transformed into a conversation about her emotional distress. And I left those interactions feeling guilty for asking questions. That realization honestly made me sick the first time it fully landed. Because how does somebody rearrange your emotional instincts so thoroughly that you start apologizing for expecting accountability? That's not normal. That's conditioning. And I think deep down I already knew that before I consciously admitted it. There was this period, probably 6 months or so, where I existed in this horrible emotional middle ground. Suspicious enough to feel anxious constantly, but not ready to fully confirm what I suspected. And during that time, there were moments where I could have dug deeper. I could have contacted people. Asked harder questions. Compared stories. I didn't. And I need to be honest about that because it matters. Part of me was actively avoiding certainty. Because certainty would have meant losing her. And despite everything, despite the growing unease and the inconsistencies and the anxiety, I still loved her enough that losing the friendship felt more terrifying than living inside confusion a little longer. But what I eventually realized about myself during that period honestly hurt more than anything she actually did. What I eventually realized is that I wasn't just being misled. I was participating in it. And I don't say that to shift blame away from her. I don't. I know exactly who initiated the deception, at least in broad terms. But there's this uncomfortable truth I had to sit with later, that I stayed in the fog longer than I needed to. Not because I was stupid. Not because I didn't see anything. But because I didn't want clarity if clarity meant loss. That's the part that really messed with me afterward. Because I like to think of myself as someone who values truth. Even uncomfortable truth. But in that situation, I was negotiating with myself constantly. If I ask the wrong question, I might lose her. If I dig too deep, I might destroy something I still depend on emotionally. And I remember one night sitting in my car after work, just not going inside right away. I was holding my phone, half open to her contact, and I had this instinct to text her something completely normal. Something small. A joke from earlier in the day. My brain still reached for her like muscle memory. And I stopped mid-sentence. And just sat there thinking. If I text her right now, what am I actually doing? Am I connecting with someone real, or just maintaining something I'm afraid to lose? That question didn't have a clean answer. And I hated that. Because I like clean answers. I like things that resolve. This didn't resolve. It just kept unfolding in my head in new ways. And the worst part was how normal she still felt during all of this. Because when I saw her in person, nothing was dramatically wrong. She was still warm. Still attentive. Still funny in that effortless way that made people relax around her. Still asking about my kids. Still remembering details I forgot I had even told her. So I kept getting emotionally pulled back in. That's what made it so destabilizing. My intuition would flare up, and then she'd act like the safest person in the world again, and I'd feel myself soften without even realizing it. It was like my brain couldn't hold both realities at once. And I think that's what kept me stuck for so long. Not denial exactly. More like emotional interference. Because even while things were starting to feel off, the version of her I had built over 9 years didn't disappear. It kept overlapping everything. Hospital waiting rooms. Late-night phone calls. The way she showed up when my mother was sick. The way she sat with me during one of the hardest weeks of my life and didn't leave. Those moments happened. I know they did. And that's where it gets complicated in a way I still struggle to explain to people. Because I've had friends say things like, well, if she was manipulating you, then none of it was real. But that's not how it feels internally. That's not how memory works. Because those moments felt real to me. The comfort was real. The emotional support was real. So then, what do you do with that? How do you categorize a relationship that contains both genuine care and calculated behavior? I still don't fully have an answer. My therapist once said something that stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. She said, people can meet real emotional needs and still be unsafe. And I remember just sitting there thinking, that's exactly what this feels like. Not a clean betrayal. Something messier. Something that doesn't resolve neatly in your head even when you understand it logically. And around that time, I started doing something I didn't realize was changing me. I started remembering things differently. Not because the events changed. But because the context did. A memory of her comforting me in my kitchen after a stressful day suddenly felt different in hindsight. A conversation where she gave me advice about my marriage now had a second layer I couldn't ignore. Even her kindness started feeling layered. And I hated that. Because I didn't want my entire past to feel contaminated. But it did. At least for a while. And then something happened that pushed everything from confusing into something I couldn't ignore anymore. I ran into someone else who knew her. And that person said something so small, so casually strange, that it ended up changing everything that came after. I didn't realize it at the time. But that was the moment the illusion stopped being something I could hold together in my head. It wasn't even a dramatic conversation. That's what still bothers me. No confrontation. No shocking revelation. No moment where everything finally snaps into place in some cinematic way. It was just a grocery store. Fluorescent lights. Cartwheels squeaking. Someone deciding between avocados like it's the most important decision of the day. Normal life. And I ran into a woman I only kind of knew. We'd met maybe twice before through mutual connections. One of those people you recognize but don't really know. We did the usual small talk at first. How've you been? Busy, you know. That kind of thing. And then Dana's name came up naturally because at that point Dana was still woven into almost every part of my life. And I watched something shift in her face. Not obvious. Not dramatic. Just a fraction of hesitation. Like her brain registered something and immediately decided not to fully express it. That pause lasted maybe a second. But it felt longer. And then she smiled in a very controlled way and said, "Oh, you're still close with her? That's great." Still. That word. Still. I don't think I reacted in the moment. Not outwardly. I probably just nodded or laughed politely or said something meaningless. But internally, something tightened. Because still implies continuity against expectation. It implies there was a point where maybe I shouldn't be. And I left that grocery store feeling off balance in a way I couldn't immediately explain. I drove home slower than usual without really noticing I was doing it. And my mind kept replaying her tone. Not the words. The tone. And that's when something started happening that I didn't have control over anymore. My brain began pulling old moments forward without permission. Like it was building a case file I hadn't agreed to open. The promotion conversation. The concerns she raised about me. The money delays. The explanations that always felt slightly too polished when I thought about them too long. And then one memory surfaced so sharply it almost made me physically uncomfortable. A work event. Someone introducing me to Dana's colleagues. And Dana saying, casually, "This is my associate." Associate. Not friend. Not best friend. Not someone she'd spent nearly a decade building a life of emotional intimacy with. Associate. At the time I barely processed it. But now that memory kept replaying on a loop. Because once your perception shifts, the smallest details suddenly feel like clues you missed on purpose. And I started noticing everything differently after that grocery store moment. That's really when the real unraveling began. Not externally. Internally. I began realizing something I hadn't wanted to admit to myself. I didn't actually know Dana in the way I thought I did. I knew her emotional presence. Her reactions. Her stories. Her humor. Her timing. But when I tried to pin down factual consistency, things started getting blurry. Certain stories didn't line up perfectly over time. Some people she referenced constantly. I had never actually met. Some parts of her life existed in compartments that never seemed to connect in any verifiable way. And once I noticed that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. It felt like discovering that someone had been curating slightly different versions of themselves, depending on who they were with. And I had just assumed mine was the real one. That realization didn't hit all at once. It came in waves. Little uncomfortable moments stacked on top of each other until I couldn't ignore them anymore. And the worst part was this, even while I was starting to question everything, she didn't feel distant. If anything, she felt closer. That's what confused me the most. Because instead of pulling away when I became more cautious, she leaned in. More messages. More warmth. More emotional check-ins. "I was thinking about you. I miss you. How are you really doing?" It felt like she could sense the shift before I fully understood it myself. And part of me responded to that warmth automatically. Because I still wanted it. That's the part one didn't want to admit. Even while I was questioning things, I still felt relief when she acted like the version of her I trusted. It made everything easier to doubt again afterward. Like emotional whiplash I couldn't stabilize. And during this entire slow unraveling, the money situation kept sitting in the background like a low, constant pressure I didn't fully address anymore. She did pay some of it back. That detail matters because it complicated everything. It wasn't clean theft. It wasn't total disappearance. It was partial repayment over time. Small amounts. Spread out. Always with explanations attached. I'm trying. I feel terrible. I haven't forgotten you. And somehow, in almost every conversation about it, I ended up comforting her. Not aggressively. Not consciously. Just, naturally. Like the emotional center of gravity kept shifting away from my loss and toward her distress. And I didn't fully see that while it was happening. Only later. When I looked back and realized how many times I walked away from conversations about my own money feeling guilty for even bringing it up. That realization made my stomach drop. Because how does that even happen? How does someone reframe your own boundary into something you feel bad enforcing? And I think deep down, I already knew the answer. Even before I admitted it. Because there was a period of time, months, maybe longer, where I could have stepped fully into clarity. I could have asked sharper questions. I could have pushed harder. I could have broken the illusion sooner. But I didn't. And not because I couldn't. Because part of me still wasn't ready to lose her. Even while another part of me was already starting to see who she might actually be. And what I eventually understood about myself during that period is what hurt the most of all. What I eventually understood is that I wasn't just confused. I was attached. And I know that sounds obvious when I say it out loud now, but at the time it didn't feel that simple. It felt like confusion. Like uncertainty. Like I was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. But really, I was emotionally holding on. Even while part of me was slowly stepping back. That's the thing that made it so hard to leave mentally before I ever left physically. Because there were moments I could have gotten clarity. Real clarity. I could have asked direct questions. I could have compared stories more aggressively. I could have confronted inconsistencies earlier. But I didn't. And I need to be honest about why. Because clarity wasn't just information. Clarity meant consequence. Clarity meant losing her. And I wasn't ready for that. Even while I was starting to suspect that the version of her I loved might not fully exist the way I believed it did. I still wasn't prepared to let go of the role she played in my life. That's the part that really unsettles me when I think back on it. Not that I was fooled. But that I chose uncertainty over loss for longer than I should have. And I don't say that to blame myself. I really don't. I think that's just how attachment works. It doesn't shut off cleanly just because your logic starts catching up. There's a delay between knowing and accepting. And I lived inside that delay for a long time. I remember one night sitting in my car after work and just not going inside right away. I had my phone in my hand. Her name was right there in my recent messages. And I almost texted her something completely normal. Something small and meaningless. And I stopped mid-thought and just sat there thinking. Who am I actually talking to when I talk to her now? And I didn't have an answer I liked. Because there were still two versions of her living in my head at that point. The version who brought me food after my mother's surgery. The version who sat with me in hospital waiting rooms and held my hand when I couldn't stop crying. The version who knew every detail of my life and made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And then, the version that didn't fully line up with those memories anymore. The version that felt strategically warm in hindsight. I couldn't reconcile them. So I just stayed stuck in between. And I think that's what people don't understand about situations like this. You don't immediately switch from trust to clarity. You oscillate. Back and forth. One moment you're convinced something is wrong. The next moment they say something kind or familiar or grounding and you feel yourself soften again. It's destabilizing in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived it. Because the emotional bond doesn't disappear just because suspicion enters the room. It lingers. And in my case, it lingered for months. Even while the financial part of the situation kept quietly unraveling. She did repay some of the money. That part matters because it complicates everything emotionally. It wasn't a clean disappearance. It wasn't total refusal. It was partial repayment over time, always wrapped in emotion. I feel awful. I'm doing my best. You've been so patient with me. And somehow, in almost every conversation about my own loss, I ended up comforting her. That pattern didn't fully register in real time. But later, when I replayed everything, it hit me hard. Because I wasn't just losing money. I was being emotionally redirected away from my own boundary. And I didn't even notice it happening while I was inside it. That realization is still uncomfortable to sit with. Because it makes you question your own judgment in a deeper way than just, I trusted the wrong person. It becomes, why did I accept emotional rearrangement like that? And the honest answer is, because I still cared about her. Even then. Even when things didn't fully make sense anymore. There was still a part of me that wanted her to be who I believed she was. And I think that part of me delayed everything. Not ignorance. Not stupidity. Attachment. And eventually, something had to break that cycle. For me, it wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a dramatic ending. It was distance. Silence. And time. And then the slow, uncomfortable process of realizing that I wasn't going to get a clean explanation that made everything make sense. That was hard. Because I like answers that resolve neatly. This didn't. This never did. There was no final conversation where everything clicked into place. No moment where she admitted everything and I walked away feeling closure. Just messages I stopped responding to. And a life that gradually stopped including her in it. And what surprised me most wasn't the anger. It was the grief. Because I still miss her sometimes. Not the situation. Not the confusion. But the version of the friendship I thought I had. The version where I believed I had found someone who would stay in my life long term in a way that felt steady and safe. That version mattered to me. And losing it felt like losing something real, even if the foundation underneath it wasn't what I thought. That's what I still sit with sometimes when I look at the lake photo. Because I still haven't deleted it. And I don't think I will. Not because I'm holding on to her. But because I don't want to erase the version of me who was genuinely happy in that moment. She was real. My trust was real. My life was real. Even if the story underneath it turned out to be more complicated than I ever wanted to believe. And I think that's the only ending I have. Not closure. Not clarity. Just acceptance that two things can be true at the same time. I was loved in the way I understood it. And I was also deeply misled in ways I didn't see until much later. And somehow, I have to learn to hold both of those truths without letting either one erase the other.